Hi, my name is Susan Charnley. I'm a research social scientist with the Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Research Station, and I'm based in Portland, Oregon. I'm going to talk to you today about ranchers, beavers, and stream restoration on Western range lands. So, beaver-related restoration has been a very popular stream restoration approach over the last decade, but very little is known about the human dimensions of beaver-related restoration. When you do BRR, as I'll call it for short, on Western rangelands, you're typically doing it either on private lands that are owned by ranchers or on public lands where ranchers have grazing allotments where they take their livestock seasonally to graze. Therefore, the focus of this study is on ranchers and beavers and beaver-related restoration. And the purpose of the study was to understand what is needed to create a more supportive social environment for this increasingly popular restoration approach. Okay, I'm going to turn off my camera now so that it does not interfere with the following slides. So I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators in this research, Hannah Gosnell, Rachel DeVee, and Jesse Abrams. I'd also like to acknowledge our project funder, the Northwest Climate Hub, and our partner, the Northwest Climate Science Center. And I'd also like to thank the interviewees who participated in this study. So what is beaver-related restoration? Well, there are three main kinds. Two kinds involve beaver themselves. The first kind we call riparian revegetation. This is where riparian areas are encouraged to revegetate with restoration approaches such as using fencing to keep out livestock or other browsers and grazers, or changing grazing management in those areas to encourage revegetation, and then by the process of creating natural habitat for beaver, that encourages beaver to come back on their own and colonize those areas. It can also involve planting riparian vegetation. The second kind involving beaver generally entails removing nuisance beavers from places that they aren't wanted and relocating them to places where they are wanted because they can potentially provide desired environmental benefits. The second category of beaver-related restoration involves constructing a whole variety of different kinds of artificial beaver dam-like structures in streams. These are designed to mimic the effects of natural beaver dams and hopefully to bring about environmental consequences that are similar to the desired effects of natural beaver dams themselves. So why would we want to engage in beaver-related restoration? Well, it has many potential benefits. These include improved water availability, both through increasing groundwater storage as well as improving surface water flows. It can reduce stream erosion and stream incision. It can improve riparian and wetland habitat, which is particularly important for other species that depend on that habitat. It can also improve aquatic habitat for fish, and in fact many such projects have been implemented for the purpose of recovering Endangered Species Act listed fish. And this approach to restoration is relatively low cost, and it relies on natural processes to try to restore natural processes and functions to ecosystems, which is desired by some people. And then finally, because beaver dams can help to regulate stream flows, it may help to promote climate change adaptation. So we looked at four main research topics in this study. The first was how do beavers, beaver dams, and beaver-related restoration affect ranching operations and vice versa? For example, how do livestock affect beaver dams and beavers themselves? Second, we examined ranchers' views of beavers, beaver dams, and beaver-related restoration. What do they think of it? Third, we looked at the policy context for BRR and how that might influence implementation. And by the policy context, what I mean here are state regulations for managing beaver, state and federal regulations that affect the building of in-stream structures, and potentially management around water rights if there are potential impacts to water rights from these projects. And then fourth, we tried to look at how ranchers, practitioners of these strategies, agencies, and their partners can best work together to have successful BRR projects. Our approach was a case study approach. We identified 6 case studies of BRR projects, and those occurred in 4 states, Oregon, Idaho, California, and Nevada. For those cases, we reviewed the relevant literature, we looked at databases, and we looked at project websites. We also conducted semi-structured interviews with people who were stakeholders in these projects. And across all 6 cases, we interviewed 105 people. About half of them were ranchers, but these were not randomly selected ranchers. They were ranchers who had been participating in these projects or their neighbors. And then the other half that we interviewed were agency staff or NGO staff. Well, I don't have time today to talk about what we found relating to all of those 4 research topics that I just identified. What I am going to focus on today is 6 social factors that we identified across the cases as a result of cross-case comparison and analysis that are important for creating this supportive social environment for beaver-related restoration. And this photo actually is an aerial photo of one of the projects that we studied. All those little lines are artificial beaver dams. Okay, well, the first factor we found was really important, of course, is that ranchers are going to be more likely to support beaver-related restoration when they perceive that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. Now, the ranchers that we interviewed for this study typically identified both advantages and disadvantages of beavers and their dams. The key disadvantages that they identified were that beavers typically will clog irrigation infrastructure in their hay fields. Most of the ranchers in our study grow hay in the winter in order to feed to their cattle during that time. Sorry, they grow hay in the summer to feed their cattle in the winter. And they do so using irrigation techniques, and beavers like to clog up irrigation heads and other irrigation infrastructure, canals and so forth. They also mentioned that beavers sometimes cause flooding to pastures and roadways. The main advantages of beavers, however, and their dams is that they help to increase water availability, particularly late into the dry season when streams normally dry up. They found that there was much more water available later into the dry season in places where there were beavers and beaver dams. And they also found that beaver dams increase the production of forage for livestock, particularly in riparian areas where these dams had the consequence of increasing groundwater levels. In fact, one rancher even reported that he no longer had to do irrigation, that he simply got more production of hay in his hay fields from groundwater level rises that he attributed to the BRR project. So although ranchers identified both drawbacks and advantages and benefits of BRR and beaver dams, they would typically say that the benefits by far outweighed the drawbacks and that it was worth it to put up with beavers and their drawbacks in order to gain these benefits for their ranching operations. Well, second, we found that the drawbacks of beavers and their dams can be mitigated by non-lethal mitigation techniques that reduce those negative effects of beavers. Now, sometimes the nuisance beavers have been removed through trapping, or ranchers have gone in with excavators or with dynamite to try and get rid of their beaver dams, but some of those can have lethal consequences for beaver, which can undermine the restoration effort. However, there are a number of non-lethal mitigation techniques that can be used to reduce these negative impacts of beaver. You're looking at pictures of some of them here. On the right, you can put fencing around trees that you don't want to have cut down by beaver, or you can use these flow devices that prevent road culverts from getting clogged. There are also things like pond levelers that prevent beaver ponds from rising and flooding as a result of high water levels, high stream flow events. And there are a number of ways of providing education and assistance for landowners to make them more aware of these practices and to help them adopt these non-lethal mitigation techniques, for example, through workshops and through demonstration projects. Non-governmental organizations such as watershed councils can be a particularly good venue for educating and assisting landowners with these mitigation techniques. Third, we found that grazing practices in riparian areas need to be compatible with BRR, and that means that ranchers might sometimes need to adapt their grazing management in riparian areas. As you may know, livestock like to use riparian areas for forage, for water, and for shade in the summertime, but they can potentially have detrimental impacts in those zones by reducing vegetation there and by altering stream morphology. This can be detrimental for beaver habitat. And so there are some strategies that can be used to prevent those negative consequences. In some of our projects, there was riparian fencing installed, as you see on the left, that kept livestock out of those areas and led to vegetation recovery that then made beaver come in or made the artificial beaver dams more successful in their restoration impacts. But you can also adopt conservation-oriented grazing management practices, and that means controlling the time and the timing of when livestock are in those riparian pastures so that you can have healthy riparian areas that provide beaver habitat and are favorable for beaver-related restoration. The fourth item that we found important to providing a supportive social environment for BRR was low harvest pressure on beavers. Now, if you're trying to encourage beavers to come into an area, but there are not very many beavers around because of trapping, that can be a problem, and potentially it may warrant some localized restrictions on trapping at the sites where you're trying to do your project. Now, beaver populations may not be a limiting factor where you're doing BRR, and in fact, across our 6 case studies, we did not find that harvest pressure was limiting the ability of these projects to be successful. As you can see from this chart, beaver harvest statewide over the last couple of decades has really dropped off in the 4 states where we did our research. And again, nobody reported that this was a problem, but it could potentially be a localized problem, in which case some kind of management intervention might be warranted. In fact, in the state of Oregon, this is under debate at the moment, where there's been a proposal to ban all beaver trapping on federal lands. And would that be an effective approach to encouraging beaver-related restoration? Well, we don't really have sufficient research to know that. It might be warranted in localized areas where it's a problem, but it might be that trapping is not the problem, that it's more a habitat problem or a predation problem or whatnot. So this is something that may be called for, but it could depend on location. Fifth, beaver-related restoration calls for a regulatory environment that enables experimentation, flexibility, and adaptive management. That's because this is an approach that relies on an animal, the beaver, whose behavior is somewhat unpredictable. It also occurs in stream environments, which are dynamic and changing over time. And also, different restoration sites have different social and ecological conditions, so the type of restoration strategy that you implement there has to be appropriate to those local social and ecological conditions. So because there's a lot of variation over sites, you might need to have experimentation to find the right approach suitable to the site you're at. And you also may need to have regulatory flexibility to take into account some of the unexpected consequences of implementing these projects to see how people respond and how stream systems respond, and to adapt management approaches accordingly. At 3 of our restoration sites that involved implementing artificial beaver dams, the regulatory situation was the major impediment to having a successful project. That's understandable if you're dealing with a site where there are threatened and endangered fish species, because you don't want your regulations to allow for in-stream structures that might threaten those fish populations. But at the same time, if you don't have enough regulatory flexibility to go along with this approach, then either it's not going to happen, or people may go ahead and do it without getting the required permits, neither of which is ideal. Sixth, we found that you really need to have very committed project leadership and effective partnerships in order to make this restoration successful. Sorry. And you have to have landowners who are willing to have these projects implemented on their properties, and you also have to have grazing permittees who are willing to go along with the program. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of conflict and you're not going to have as much social support. So it's really important to maintain good relationships with landowners and permittees during these projects. and you need partners who can contribute capacity and resources and technical expertise, and you need project leaders that are committed and willing to stay with it through the long haul, because beaver-related restoration is not a one-time approach, it's a long-term process. Well, to conclude then, considering the human dimensions of restoration projects is not going to ensure that you get your desired outcomes, but it will make the possibility for having successful projects a lot more likely. So again, it's super important to consider not just the biophysical, but also the human dimensions of restoration projects when undertaking them. Okay, thank you very much. This is my contact information, and if you're interested in learning more about this research, I'd like to refer you to a recently published article in Rangeland Ecology and Management where you can read all about it. Thank you.